The ballroom was full,
I am
hundreds of
completely done
guests,
with you.
silk dresses, tailored tuxedos. Champagne raised high under crystal chandeliers. At the center stood a woman in white, brown skin glowing under the light, diamonds at her throat. Her eyes were cold. She looked at the man she once loved, then she pulled the ring from her finger and threw it. It struck his chest. It hit the marble floor. The sound was small, but it was the only sound anyone remembered. "Love doesn't pay bills," she said. Beside her, the billionaire laughed. Easy, careless, the laugh of a man who had never answeried about anything. "Always be a nobody," he said. The guests clapped. Some laughed along. Nobody defended the man standing alone in the middle of all that noise. He lowered his head. For 1 second it looked like defeat, then he smiled. "One day," he said quietly, "you'll regret today." Laughter only grew louder. Someone raised a toast. 3 years later. A convoy of black Rolls-Royces rolled into Seoul, headlights cutting through fog, helicopters tracking low overhead. Men who ran entire districts of the city bowed their heads as the car sped. A voice moved through the crowd like a current. "Boss has arrived." The lead car slowed. A door opened. It was him. Nobody who laughed in that ballroom would ever laugh at that name again. But to understand how a nobody becomes a name that makes a city bow, you have to go back to where it started, not with a convoy, not with fear, with a warehouse, a woman, and a promise neither of them kept the way they meant to. Seoul did not care about Daniel Kim. For the first 28 years of his life, that suited him fine. He never asked the city for anything. He asked only for a small apartment with a leaking window, a bowl of rice that lasted the month, and one woman who believed love could outwork poverty. Her name was Sophia. Brown skin. A quick, disarming smile that made strangers trust her before she'd said a word. She grew up 2 buildings down from him. Flickering streetlights. Landlords who never fixed anything unless you threatened to leave. She used to sit on the concrete steps and watch Daniel walk home from the warehouse, grease under his fingernails. Exhaustion folded into his shoulders like a second shirt. She used to think there was something unbearable about how hard he tried. "You don't have to prove anything to me," she told him once. The night he proposed with a ring bought on a payment plan. 8 months to finish paying it off. "What am I proving?" he asked, half laughing. Terrified she'd say something that didn't match the box he'd built for the ring. "You don't quit," she said, even when quitting would be easier. He held onto that sentence for years, through 18-hour days, warehouse shift, delivery route until 2 a.m. weekend freight loading at the port because the foreman paid extra for men. Willing to skip sleep, he held onto it when he sold his father's watch. The only thing he owned that had belonged to somebody who loved him first. He held onto it when their garden hall wedding shrank down to a registry office. Folding chairs, no other way to make the math work and still eat that month. His mother had cried at that wedding too, not from joy, from worry. She'd pulled Daniel aside before the ceremony, straightened his collar, and said the only thing she ever said about Sophia out loud. "She loves you now," his mother said. "Make sure you're still someone worth loving when things get harder, not just someone worth pitying." Daniel laughed it off at the time. He didn't understand yet that his mother had seen something in Sophia's smile that he was too in love to notice, a smile that worked hardest exactly when things were easiest, and thinned out almost imperceptibly whenever the hard years stretched it in too long. Sophia smiled through it anyway. She wore a dress she'd altered herself. She told everyone it was the most beautiful day of her life. For a while, Daniel believed her completely. For 3 years, they built something that looked from a distance like a life. Up close, it looked like exhaustion. There was a night in their 2nd year. Sophia came home to find him asleep, sitting upright at her kitchen table, still in his warehouse uniform, a bowl of cold rice in front of him. She didn't wake him right away. She just watched. When he stirred and saw her there, Chef forced a smile a half-second too late for him not to notice what came before it. "You should eat something with the rice," she said. "Just rice isn't enough." "It's enough," he said. "It's what's here." She sat across from him. For a moment, he thought she might finally say the thing that had been building in her for months. Instead, she took his hand. "We won't always live like this," he agreed, meaning it completely. "We won't." He believed they were picturing the same future. He didn't understand, not for a long time, that Sophia had already begun picturing a different one. A future that didn't need both of them to survive the hard years, Only one of them, and it didn't have to be him. He noticed the small changes the way an exhausted man notices anything. Late, and Anla partly. She stopped mentioning her days off in detail. She started keeping her phone face down on the counter. She came home one night smelling faintly of unfamiliar cologne and told him it was nothing. A coworker's hug at a birthday party, he believed her. Believing cost nothing. Doubting would have cost him something he wasn't ready to spend. 3 months later, Ethan Park proposed. In the private dining room of a hotel that took up an entire block of Gangnam, he didn't ask if she loved him. He asked if she was tired. She said yes to both. Though only one had been spoken aloud, she didn't want a quiet ending. She wanted the city to see her choice. Witnesses. A story no one could later argue with. She invited Daniel to what he believed was a farewell dinner. Two people trying to part with some dignity intact. Instead, he walked into a ballroom at the Grand Heritage Hotel. Hundreds of guests. Ethan's business partners. Minor celebrities. Journalists somehow already tipped off. All gathered for an engagement celebration scheduled, deliberately, for the same night she'd asked him to sign the divorce papers. He signed them in front of everyone. Nobody told him there would be an audience. Sophia stood at the center of the room in a white dress, not a wedding dress, cut close in auto one that the symbolism landed anyway. The ring was already twisted half off her finger before he'd even set down the pen. She pulled it free, and through it struck his chest. It dropped to the marble floor. The small sound reached every corner of the ballroom. "Love doesn't pay bills," she said, loud enough that the orchestra actually paused. Ethan Park laughed beside her. Easy, untroubled. "You'll always be a nobody," he said. Few words carried clean across the room. The guests laughed. Some clapped, deciding the way crowds decide things. That laughing was safer than silence. Daniel lowered his head. For one long second it looked like surrender, then he smiled. Small, quiet, without anger. "One day," he said, "you'll regret today." Laughter only grew. Someone toasted the newly engaged couple. Daniel picked the ring off the floor, put it in his pocket without a word, and walked out through hundreds of people who had already decided exactly what kind of man he was. He found out about the wedding itself the same way most of Seoul did. From a headline, he was in the break room at the construction site where he worked security, eating instant noodles. A coworker's phone lit up, a photo of Sophia in a dress that cost more than his father's entire life savings. Standing beside the man who'd called him a nobody in front of 300 witnesses. He didn't cry in front of anyone. He finished the noodles. He finished his shift. He walked 4 kilometers home instead of paying for the bus, because he'd stopped letting himself feel things he couldn't afford. And that week, grief felt like the most expensive thing in the world. The internet did what the internet does. Someone found an old photo. Daniel, thin and tired, standing outside a payday loan office. A failed small business loan application. Someone paired it with the wedding photos. Someone wrote a caption. By the end of the week, he had a title he never asked for and could never remove. The poorest husband in Korea. Comment sections filled with strangers who had opinions about a marriage they knew nothing about. Talk shows used his story as a punchline. A late-night host built an entire bit around it, the Daniel Kim effect. The idea that a woman should always trade up when the chance came. Framed as comedy, landing as cruelty. His mother called him crying on the third day, not because she believed any of it. A neighbor had shown her the posts, thinking she deserved to know. "Read it," Daniel told her. Though he'd already read most of it himself, standing in a stairwell during his lunch break. Scrolling with the specific numb concentration of a man picking at a wound to see how deep it went. "They don't know you," his mother said. "They don't know what you gave up for that girl." "Doesn't matter what they know," Daniel said. Something in his voice made her go quiet, sound like her son anymore. It sounded like someone older, colder, already halfway to becoming someone else. He saw Sophia exactly once after the divorce was finalized. Uninvited. Standing outside the marble lobby of Ethan's building in Gangnam. He waited nearly 2 hours before she appeared, dressed in clothes worth more than every outfit he'd ever owned combined. She saw him and stopped. Something flickered across her face. Guilt, maybe, or just surprise at how thin he'd gotten. "Daniel, I'm not here to make a scene," he said quietly. I just want to ask you something, then I'll go. She crossed her arms, glanced once toward the lobby door. Did you ever love me? He asked. Or did you just love the idea that I'd eventually stop being poor? Her mouth opened, then closed. For a moment, something almost honest moved behind her eyes. It's not that simple, Daniel. It's exactly that simple, he said. You just don't want to say it out loud. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked away. It was the last conversation they would have for 3 years. Daniel disappeared. Not dramatically. No note. No final confrontation to give the story a satisfying shape for anyone watching from outside. He simply stopped showing up. He quit the security job by text message. Gave up the apartment lease. Sold the last of his furniture to a second-hand dealer for less than it was worth because he needed cash faster than needed dignity. His mother received one message. I need to go somewhere for a while. Please don't worry. I'll explain everything eventually. Then his number stopped working. For a few weeks, people in the old neighborhood talked about it. Gossip mixed with half-genuine concern that evaporated once something more interesting came along. Some said he'd moved to another city, ashamed, unable to bear being recognized. Some said, with a knowing little laugh, that he'd probably done something desperate. Men halast everything sometimes did. A rumor circulated for a while. He'd been seen boarding a cargo ship bound for Busan, working under a false name. The kind of story that gets repeated at parties because it sounds true and nobody can actually check. Someone else swore they'd seen him begging outside a subway station in Daegu, unrecognizable, and that version of the rumor traveled fastest of all because it fit the ending people expected for a man like him. Poor men who lose everything, the story went, simply lose more. There was no version of Daniel Kim that the old neighborhood was prepared to imagine climbing instead of falling. Months passed, then a year. Sophia, fully absorbed into the gleaming, frictionless world of Park Holdings, heard the rumor secondhand. Filtered through acquaintances testing whether the subject was still painful, she always said the same thing in the same practiced tone. I hope he's okay. I hope he found some peace. She believed it mostly. She'd built a version of the story where she hadn't destroyed anything, where Daniel was simply a chapter that ended naturally, where whatever happened to him afterward was sad but not hers to carry. She did not know that 400 kilometers away, in a shipping district that answered to no government fully, a man with no name and no papers had walked into the back office of a struggling logistics broker. He asked, in a voice so calm it unsettled the room, for a job moving cargo nobody wanted to ask questions about. She did not know the broker's name was Yang-Soo Beek, a mid-tier operator with debts to men far more dangerous than himself. Within 18 months, that broker would be dead. Not by Daniel's hand, through a chain of decisions Daniel had quietly engineered. Patient as a tide, moving pieces nobody noticed were being moved at all. She did not know that Daniel Kim, the poorest husband in Korea, had spent that first year sleeping 4 hours a night in a converted shipping container. Learning 3 languages off-commerce that mattered more than any spoken tongue, the language of ports, the language of debt, the language of fear. She did not know any of it, because nobody did. There was one more thing nobody knew, not even the small circle of men who worked for him then. Daniel kept his father's watch, the one he'd sold in his first year of marriage, in a drawer in the shipping container, bought back quietly through an intermediary who never knew whose errand he was truly running. Daniel never wore it. He simply kept it where he could see it, a reminder of the version of himself that had once believed love alone could be collateral enough against the world. And that, more than the money, more than the danger, more than anything else he built in the years that followed, was exactly the way Daniel Kim wanted it. Because a man who has been humiliated in full public view learns something most people never learn. The only revenge worth having is the kind nobody sees coming until it's already finished. 3 years is enough time to erase a face from public memory. It is not enough time to erase what a city becomes when someone patient and ruthless decides to remake it from the shadows. By the 3rd year, Seoul's business world had grown used to a name nobody could attach to a photograph: the Shadow Dragon. It started as a rumor among port authorities, a syndicate absorbing shipping routes one struggling company at a time, always through legal channels, always through debt bought quietly at a discount, always through contracts that looked, on paper, like ordinary acquisitions. Then it became a rumor among bankers. Certain accounts moved with a discipline that read less like a criminal enterprise and more like a hedge fund with teeth. Then it reached the politicians, whispered over closed-door dinners. 3 city council members who'd opposed a rezoning deal near the Incheon shipping corridor had, within the same financial quarter, watched their family businesses audited, boycotted, or bought out from under them. Shell companies. No trail anyone could follow, nobody had seen the shadow dragon's face. That detail alone made grown men's hands shake when they said the name. An organization with no face is an organization you cannot negotiate with. You don't know who to flatter, who to bribe, who to fear specifically. You simply fear the whole shape of it, all its tones, all the time. What almost nobody knew, what only a handful of men bound by old debts and older loyalties understood, was that the Shadow Dragon was not, in fact, a criminal empire the way tabloids imagined. No drugs moved through its ports. No violence was ordered from its offices. What little there had been in the earliest, most desperate months had been buried permanently by the only man who knew where those decisions were kept. The truth was simpler and more frightening. Daniel Kim had built an empire almost entirely out of other people's mistakes, other people's debts, other people's blind confidence that a poor man from a warehouse could never become anything worth watching. He'd started with the shipping broker, Yang-soo Beek, buying up the man's debts from 3 separate lenders through a shell company, using the leverage not to destroy him but to learn from him. Every port contact, every customs official who could be persuaded, every route that mattered. When Beek eventually overreached and made an enemy of the wrong Triad affiliate, Daniel didn't lift a finger to save him. He simply made sure that when Beek's protection evaporated, the businesses transferred cleanly, legally, permanently into Daniel's control before anyone else could claim them. From there, it was a matter of scale. Yang-soo Beek never saw it coming, even at the end. He'd built his career on believing that debt was just another kind of friendship, that whoever held your paper would always need you more than you needed them, because a dead borrower pays nothing back. He didn't understand that Daniel had never wanted his money back. Daniel had wanted his knowledge, his contacts, his decades of quiet relationships with customs officials who could make a shipping container disappear from a manifest entirely. Once Daniel had extracted all of it patiently, over 18 months of carefully staged meetings that Beek mistook for mentorship, the man's usefulness simply ran out at the exact moment his enemies caught up with him. Beek called Daniel the night before he died, panicked, asking for protection. He assumed a business partner owed him. Daniel let the call go to voicemail. He listened to it twice, the next morning, standing alone in the container with his first cup of coffee of the day, and then headlighted it because there was nothing in it he needed to keep. He lived through the second year in the same converted shipping container, the same 3 shirts. He'd learned something most billionaires never learn, that real hunger teaches patience money can't buy back once it's gone soft. He reinvested everything. Holding companies stacked inside holding companies. A structure so deliberately confusing that even the accountants managing individual pieces had no idea they were building the financial skeleton of the most feared organization in the country. There was a night in his second year, a single desk lamp, a stack of customs manifests. A man named Chul Woo Han, one of Daniel's first hires, asked a question no one else had dared ask. Why not spend any of it? Han gestured at the ledgers, numbers that already represented more wealth than either of them had imagined touching. You could disappear to Switzerland tomorrow and never work again. Daniel didn't look up. Because the moment I start living like I've already won, he said, I start making the decisions of a man who has something to lose. I'm not ready to be careless yet. When will you be ready? He finally looked up. When the people who made me nothing understand exactly what nothing was capable of becoming. Han never asked again, but he told the story quietly to the small circle of loyal lieutenants Daniel had assembled. It became something close to scripture inside an organization with no name on any door, no headquarters in any registry, No face the public could put to the fear it inspired. That same year, a rival syndicate tried to muscle into Daniel's shipping routes. Two enforcers arrived at the container yard with an offer that was really a threat wearing a suit. Daniel didn't have them removed by force. He listened to the entire pitch, nodded once. 3 weeks later, the syndicate's leader found himself the subject of a tax investigation, so precisely targeted. He spent the next 4 years fighting extradition instead of expanding his territory. Daniel had simply forwarded a folder to an incorruptible young prosecutor who'd spent her career trying to make a case stick. She never learned where the folder came from. She didn't need to. She only needed it to be true. And it was. Word spread through Seoul's underworld the way real fear spreads. Not through boasting, Daniel never boasted, but through the unsettling realization that here was someone who didn't need violence at all. And that was somehow so much worse. There were other tests that year. A construction magnate who tried to squeeze Daniel's shipping margins found his permits mysteriously delayed for 11 months by a city inspector nobody could identify or bribe. A rival broker who spread rumors that the Shadow Dragon was simply affront for a foreign cartel found himself, within a month, unable to secure so much as a warehouse lease anywhere in the port district. His name quietly flagged by landlords who never explained why. Daniel never ordered anyone hurt. He didn't need to. He had learned that fear built on inevitability outlasts fear built on violence, because violence eventually runs out of victims willing to stay silent, while inevitability simply becomes the water everyone learns to swim in without complaint. By the start of the 3rd year, the Shadow Dragon controlled, directly or through intermediaries, 40% of Seoul's shipping infrastructure. A controlling interest in 2 regional banks, silent ownership stakes in 11 companies whose CEOs had no idea who truly held their debt. One of those companies was Park Holdings. Ethan Park had grown careless in his prosperity, the way inherited wealth so often does. 2 years into his marriage, he'd expanded aggressively into shipping, a sector he understood poorly. Propping it up with debt, he assumed his family name would always refinance. He didn't know that 18 months earlier, a shell entity called Beekdu Capital Partners had quietly acquired 41% of that debt from 3 different banks. At a steep discount, staggered across jurisdictions so carefully that no single regulator ever saw the full pattern. Daniel Kim had been sitting inside Ethan Park's company for over a year, waiting. The way Ammon waits when he has already decided the ending, and is simply enjoying the architecture of getting there. Sophia knew none of it. Her life had settled into a rhythm of charity boards, personal stylists, and a marriage grown comfortable in the hollow way marriages built on convenience tend to grow. She still thought about Daniel sometimes, though never for long. Usually late at night, when Ethan was traveling and the house felt too large for one person to sleep inside comfortably, she'd wonder in those moments whether he'd found someone else, whether he'd forgiven her, whether the version of him she'd left behind still existed anywhere at all. She never let herself wonder for more than a few minutes. There was always a charity gala to plan, a dress to choose, a version of her life waiting to distract her from the one question she never let herself finish asking. She and Ethan hosted the largest charity gala in Seoul that autumn, the Grand Heritage Hotel, raising funds, officially, for children's hospitals. Though everyone understood its real function, letting 300 of the city's wealthiest people see and be seen by each other, the ballroom glittered. String quartet in the corner, waiters circling with champagne towers, the mayor glad-handed donors near the entrance. The police commissioner discussed golf handicaps with 2 men who owned half the construction permits in Gangnam. Sophia found Ethan near the auction table, slipped her arm through his, a gesture that photographed well and required nothing real underneath it. "You look tired," she said. "Board call ran long," Ethan said, not quite meeting her eyes. There had been more of those lately, calls that ran long. Meetings he didn't explain. She'd stopped asking. Easier not to know how the machine worked, as long as it kept producing the life she'd built her identity around. A photographer paused them near a floral arrangement worth more than a year of Daniel's old salary. Sophia arranged her face into the expression she'd perfected, warm, grateful, triumphant. The face of a woman who'd made exactly the right choice. Near the bar, two of Ethan's board members were talking in low voices about a strange pattern in the company's shipping contracts. Three major clients pulling out within the same quarter, no clear reason given, and better offers appearing from companies neither of them had heard of before. Ethan had waved it off as a rough patch. Neither man believed him, though neither said so out loud, because doubting Ethan Park out loud at Ethan Park's own gala wasn't it something men in that room did. She didn't know it would be the last photograph anyone took of her as Ethan Park's wife Thatnion would ever want to keep. She wore a diamond necklace that evening. Ethan had bought it the week before, a piece worth more than either of Daniel's entire life savings, twice over. She wore it the way people wear things when they've stopped noticing the weight. Then at 9:47 p.m. the music didn't stop exactly. It simply became irrelevant. Outside, 20 black luxury SUVs rolled to a stop, a formation too precise to be accidental, blocking the entire circular drive in under 90 seconds. The hotel's security detail, 6 men who'd never needed to do more than check a guest list, froze at their posts. Radios crackling with confusion nobody could explain. The doors opened in sequence, front to back. Like a held breath released one exhale at a time. Hundreds of men in identical dark suits stepped out, not menacing exactly, not drawing weapons, not shouting, which somehow made it worse. They simply formed a corridor from the last vehicle to the entrance, silent, waiting. The way an honor guard waits for someone who matters more than anyone currently inside that ballroom. Inside, unease moved through the crowd before anyone understood what they were reacting to. Conversations died mid-sentence. A woman near the window grabbed her husband's arm hard enough to leave a mark. The mayor's smile froze like something photographed rather than felt. The last SUV's door opened. One man stepped out, black suit, tailored with the kind of restraint only the truly powerful can afford because they no longer need to prove anything with volume. Black gloves, no jewelry, no watch. Nothing that glittered, a deliberate absence of the usual signals of wealth, which somehow made Thetwo 100 men flanking him more unsettling than any amount of gold. He walked toward the entrance without hurrying. Calm, unreadable, Sophia, standing near the center of the ballroom, champagne flute halfway to her lips, felt the crowd part and turn toward the doors the way a field of grass turns toward wind. She looked, along with everyone else, expecting some foreign dignitary. A reclusive tech founder finally making a public appearance. The man stepped into the light. For one full second, nothing in Sophia's mind connected. The face was the same and also entirely different. Leaner, harder, carved by years she knew nothing about. The softness of youth replaced by something so still it barely seemed to breathe. Then the second passed. Recognition hit her like the floor dropping out from beneath a chair she'd been sitting in for 3 comfortable years. Her champagne flute slipped from her fingers. It shattered against the marble floor. The sound sharp and small against the sudden, total silence of 300 of Seoul's most powerful people forgetting, all at once, how to speak. Across the room, Ethan Park turned to see what had caused the sound. The color left his face completely. For a moment he looked like a man who had already listened something and simply hadn't been told yet. Daniel Kim did not stop walking. He crossed the ballroom floor at the same unhurried pace he'd used getting out of the car, past round tables draped in white linen, past a string quartet that had simply stopped playing without Neon telling them to, past 300 people who had spent their entire adult lives being most important person in every room they entered. Now they understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that they were not the most important person in this one. The hotel's general manager reached him first. Director O, 11 years running the Grand Heritage. He'd once made a visiting head of state wait 4 minutes for a table. He didn't say a word. He bowed, a full bow from the waist. The kind reserved for funerals and emperors. The mayor bowed next, not because anyone told him to. Some animal instinct in a room full of powerful people had already recalibrated who held the actual power. The mayor's whole career had been built on reading that calibration a half-second before everyone else. The police commissioner followed, his golf conversation forgotten entirely. One by one, like dominoes arranged with terrible patience over 3 years, the room lower at its head, Daniel walked through all of it without acknowledging a single bow. No flicker of triumph. Triumph was for men who still needed the room's approval to know they'd won. He'd stopped needing that a long time ago. Somewhere in a converted shipping container, reading manifests by lamplight, while the version of himself that used to crave being seen slowly, deliberately, starved to death. He stopped, finally, 6 feet from Sophia. Up close the years showed on her too, not in her face maintained with Ethan's money, in her eyes. The particular exhausted brightness of someone who'd spent 3 years convincing herself of something she never fully believed. Who, she said. Her voice cracked on the single word. Small and strange in a silence so complete the crack was audible 20 feet away. Who? Are you? Daniel let the silence hold. Not cruelty, precision. He'd learned that the most powerful thing Ammon can do in a room is refuse to fill silence just because other people are uncomfortable inside it. Man you said would never become anything, he said finally. Quiet. Pitch just loud enough to carry to the edge of the crowd and no further. Nobody breathed. Ethan Park, 3 feet away, opened his mouth. Some reflex from a lifetime off being the most important man in any negotiation. Nothing came out. His body understood, even if his mind hadn't caught up yet. There is no negotiating with Ammon, who already arranged the outcome 18 months before walking through the door. Daniel didn't insult them, didn't gloat, didn't perform the speech a lesser man might have reached for. He turned, inclined his head slightly toward Director O, walked back out through the corridor of silent men. 300 of Seoul's most powerful people stood in a ballroom that suddenly felt much smaller than it had 20 minutes earlier. The revenge arrived with the same unhurried patience as everything else Daniel had built. No beating in an alley. No threats sent to Sophia. No leaked photographs. None of the things a wounded man drunk on new power might have reached for. Instead, over 6 weeks, Beekdu Capital Partners exercised a covenant clause buried on Paget 111 of a refinancing agreement Ethan's own lawyers had approved without fully reading. Nobody reads page 211 of anything when the money is already moving. The clause allowed immediate call-in of the debt under specific conditions. One of them, a drop in shipping revenue below a contractual threshold, had been engineered months earlier, patiently, through contract cancellations executed by shell companies that traced back, eventually, impossibly, to Daniel himself. Within 2 weeks, 3 of Park Holdings' largest shipping contracts were canceled. Clients who'd all recently been approached with better terms by companies nobody had heard of before at that quarter. Within 3 weeks, 2 regional banks holding Park Holdings paper, banks the Shadow Dragon quietly controlled, moved to call in loans the company could no longer service. Within 4 weeks, institutional investors, reading a wall they didn't know had been built specifically for them, began liquidating. The share price didn't fall. It evaporated. Everything happened legally. Every document signed. Every clause enforceable. Every transaction traceable to contracts Ethan's own company had agreed to in moments of careless confidence. There was no crime to prosecute, no violence to condemn, just a series of decisions that, examined individually, looked like ordinary business, and examined together looked like execution carried out with a scalpel instead of a blade. Ethan tried to fight it the only way he knew how. Lawyers. Old favors. A desperate meeting with Beekdu Capital Partners he assumed some junior executive would handle. Instead, he was shown into a glass conference room on the 40th floor of a Uedo tower. The man who walked in alone, without lawyers, without an entourage, was the same man from the gala. Ethan's mouth went dry. You, he said. This whole time it was you. It was always going to be me, Daniel said, unhurried, taking a seat across the table. Yao just didn't know to look. What do you want? Ethan's voice cracked, the practiced confidence of a man who had never lost anything real finally buckling. Money, an apology, tell me what you want and I'll. I don't want anything from you, Daniel said. There's nothing you have that I need. You already gave me the only thing that mattered 3 years ago without even knowing you were giving it. He stood, buttoned his jacket. You made me disappear, he said. I just wanted you to understand what disappearing turns Ammon into when he refuses to stay gone. He left Ethan alone in the glass room. No lawyer, no favor, no amount of old money averseloed what had already been set in motion. By the 6th week, Ethan Park was no longer a billionaire. A beautiful house he could no longer afford. A fleet of cars repossessed one by one. A wife who had married certainty, now watching that certainty dissolve in real time. He tried, in those final weeks before the divorce, to sell what remained of his name. A television interview, arranged by a publicist who still believed image could outrun arithmetic. He sat under studio lights and called the collapse a temporary liquidity event. And the host, a woman who had once fought for an interview slot at his own gala, asked him 3 follow-up questions he had no real answer for. The clip outlived his company by years, replayed as a punchline whenever business students studied the case. Sophia lost the things she traded love for, one by one. A precision that felt personal, even though Daniel had never once mentioned her name in any boardroom, any contract. In a conversation with the men who executed his instructions, she didn't need to be targeted specifically. She'd built her entire second life on the foundation of Ethan's fortune. When the foundation went, everything standing on it came down with it. The diamond necklace was the first thing to go, sold quietly to cover legal fees. Then the house. Then, within 4 months, Ethan Park himself, unable to bear the indignity of being poor in front of people who once bowed to him, filed for a divorce Sophia hadn't asked for and didn't fight. By then there was nothing left worth staying married for except 2 people reminding each other, every single day, of everything they'd lost. She moved into a 1-room apartment, a neighborhood that reminded her in ways she hated of the one she'd grown up in with Daniel 2 buildings down. She sold her remaining jewelry piece by piece, not for luxury, for rent. In the process, she found an old photograph tucked into a coat pocket she hadn't worn in years. Daniel, thin and tired, laughing at something just out of frame on their wedding day, unguarded. The kind of laugh she couldn't remember the last time she'd given anyone, including herself. That photograph was what finally sent her to Uedo, 3 months after the divorce. In weather, the forecast had called light rain and delivered as something closer to a small storm. She told herself, walking there, that Daniel would understand. That enough time had passed, that whatever he'd built, whatever he'd become, some part of him still remembered the man who used to sell his own watch so she could eat first. She believed, the way people believe things they need to be true, that if she only waited long enough in the rain, he would forgive her. She did not expect what she saw first. The glass doors of the tower opened. Daniel stepped out, not alone. A woman walked beside him, dark coat, umbrella already open against the rain, held so it covered them both. She said something Sophia couldn't hear, and Daniel laughed, a real laugh, low and easy, the kind Sophia hadn't heard directed at anyone in 3 years, the kind she used to think only she could pull out of him. He touched the woman's shoulder, guided her toward a car. She looked up at him like a person looks at someone she trusts completely, without effort, without history to forgive. The car door closed around her. Daniel stood at the curb a moment longer, watching it pull away, something almost soft crossing his face before it settled back into stillness. Sophia felt something in her chest cave in that had nothing to do with money or diamonds or the life she'd lost. She had come expecting a man frozen in the moment she'd wronged him, waiting, somewhere underneath all that power, for her to come back and complete him. Instead, she found a man who had already finished healing without her. Not out of spite. Not as all-upon aimed at her. Simply because life had kept moving during the 3 years she assumed it had stopped. He hadn't rebuilt an empire to make her regret leaving. He had rebuilt a life. And the empire was only the part of it she was allowed to see, she thought, standing there, of every version of this moment she'd rehearsed on the walk over. In every version, Daniel had been alone. Still waiting somehow, the way a wound waits to be acknowledged before it can close. She had never once considered the possibility that a wound could simply finish healing on its own without her permission, without ever needing her to come back and press against it. He never destroyed her to feel whole again. He didn't need to. He had already become someone whose wholeness no longer required her permission, her return, or her regret. That was the quiet, unbearable truth standing in the rain outside that glass tower. Revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's becoming someone they can never reach again. Daniel turned then and saw her. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look angry either. He simply walked toward her the way Ammon walks toward a piece of unfinished business he'd always known would eventually arrive. She was crying by the time he reached her. No umbrella, no makeup, no diamonds. Nothing left of the woman who had once walked into a ballroom believing herself untouchable. "Please," she said, her voice smaller than it had been in the ballroom. Smaller than he remembered it ever being, even in their worst years together. "Forgive me." Daniel stood under the awning, dry, watching her stand in the rain. For a long moment he said nothing at all, not cruelty, the same precision that had built everything he now owned. "You didn't leave because I was poor," he said finally, quiet. None of the anger she'd perhaps braced for, all of the weight that made anger unnecessary. "You left because you thought I'd stay poor forever." He let that sit in the space between them. Rain hammering the pavement, her breath catching in something that wasn't quite a sob. "That was the mistake," he said. "Not the poverty, the certainty." He turned, walked toward the convoy already idling at the curb. 20 black vehicles that would have looked absurd anywhere else in the world and looked here simply like the natural shape of a man's life finally matching the size of what he'd survived to become. The door closed. The convoy pulled away, tail lights bleeding red into the wet street. Sophia stood alone outside the glass tower, everything she'd once been promised by a different man. Everything she'd thrown away for a certainty that turned out to be the only lie in the entire story. She collapsed to her knees on the wet pavement, rain indifferent to whatever she was feeling, the city's lights blurring above her into something that no longer looked like the future she'd once been so sure she'd chosen correctly. Somewhere above her, on the top floor of a building that belonged, quietly and completely, to Ammon the whole country now feared, and no one had ever truly known, Daniel Kim stood at a window. He watched the rain fall on the city that had once called him nothing. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply turned off the light and let the dark settle over everything he had built, patient, complete, entirely his own.